everyone, and welcome to the February 2026 episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania.
And I'm Alice Cheng from the University of Toronto, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series.
Welcome to February, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year to those who will celebrate it on February 17th. Alice, I believe it will be the year of the horse coming up. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, Mike. It will be the year of the fire horse, actually, which apparently occurs every 60 years. It is supposed to bring dynamic energy, independence, bold actions, and passion for change. Now, the last year of the fire horse was in 1966, which saw the first spacecraft to orbit the moon, and it was the Soviet Union's Luna 10. It saw the launch of the Cultural Revolution in China. And also, there was significant escalation in the Vietnam War in 1966.
And on the medical side, the first human pancreas transplant occurred in 1966 at the University of Minnesota. Medicare coverage started in the United States, and health warnings appeared for the first time on cigarette packaging.
Which is pretty interesting. And on the cultural side, a couple of important events of note. The Beatles released one of their best albums of all time, in my opinion, which is Revolver. And perhaps most importantly, the first episode of Star Trek aired in September 1966. Live long and prosper.
Now, Alice, last month you mentioned that instead of fun facts for the month, we would be sharing fun facts about ourselves. So, do you have a question for us this month?
Actually, this month's question actually comes from one of our regular listeners. So it's actually from Wendy from Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. So she actually asked us, what is our favorite food? Which is not surprising because Wendy is a dietitian. So I was not shocked when Wendy decided to ask that question. But her question to us is, what is your favorite food? So Mike, you start.
All right. Well, I'll have to go with something that's really stayed with me since childhood, and that's spaghetti with meatballs. Although the pasta is really angel hair.
Oh, fancy.
And while my mom used ragu marinara sauce, my family has really settled on Rao's marinara sauce as the base.
So you've stepped up spaghetti and meatballs a little bit. Fancy spaghetti and meatballs. Excellent, excellent. For me, it's a little hard. I don't think I can give a single answer. I'm going to list off some foods which may sound random and not make much sense, but I love eggplant. I love tofu. I love spicy food. Laksa noodles, or pretty much any Asian soup noodles. I love Costco white chocolate macadamia nut cookies. And I just like ice cream. So I don't know if you can make a meal of whatever it is that I just said, but those would be on my list, and the list could certainly go on, but I will just stop there for now.
Well, I guess I know what to expect when I come visit you in Toronto, Alice. So
yes.
let's now get into the February 2026 episode of Diabetes Care on Air. Alice and I will each conduct an interview with authors of one of the feature articles, as per usual, and that'll be followed by our rapid exchange segment where we'll each pick 3 articles of interest to each of us.
And as per Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, engage. One of the feature articles from the February 2026 issue of Diabetes Care is entitled New Perspectives: 4 Unsung Heroes of Diabetes Research, which was a real treat to read as it is different from what we're typically used to seeing in diabetes care. I'm really happy to be joined by the author, Dr. Vannesa Heggie, a historian and associate professor in the History of Science and Medicine, School of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Vanessa, for agreeing to be part of this podcast, and congratulations for this feature article.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was a genuinely exciting and interesting article to write.
So I said in the intro that this article is different from what we typically see in diabetes care. This is not a randomized controlled trial. It's not a meta-analysis. There are no Kaplan-Meier curves or p-values. So how would you describe this type of article?
I'm actually not sure that it has a technical name, but I think what I'd call it is a historical provocation. So instead of starting with a research question or a hypothesis and then collecting the data and doing the analysis and presenting my argument, instead what I wanted to do was find a series of case studies, of vignettes, little studies from different times, different places, and different parts of the story of diabetes. And what I'm trying to do is show how easy and informative it is to change our perspective on the history. And these perspectives, I think, they don't just shine light on aspects of the history of diabetes that readers might not already know about, but I think they also help to show us how healthcare works or doesn't work, and how science works or sometimes doesn't work.
Absolutely. There's so much power in stories, right? And storytelling. Now, our challenge in this interview, Vanessa, is going to be to talk about your article without giving away all the details, because I will tell the audience there were parts as I was reading it that I literally gasped. I will try to not ruin what part that is, but it was just really, really well written. And you explore 4 stories about research into and treatment for diabetes. And you entitled these 4 stories The Campaigner, The Patient, The Test Subject, and The Data Set. So, can you tell us a little bit about each one to entice our readers?
Sure. So I think the names of each of the case studies are a clue. Obviously, the campaigner is, you've guessed it, about a campaigner, someone who sets up a charity organization to research into diabetes and also to support people with diabetes. And so that section is a way of thinking about the role of particular and sometimes famous people in shaping the experience of non-famous people who have diabetes and are living with diabetes, and also into things like the way that research might be funded, and some things might be funded and other things might not. The patient obviously is going to shift our perspective to a patient-centric view, and it's particularly exploring the idea of patient power and about how doctors and patients negotiate their roles and responsibilities, which I think is actually really, really crucial in chronic conditions like diabetes. Test subject, I think that's self-explanatory. The history of diabetes and research into diabetes is a history of experimentation. If we don't have test subjects, we don't have insulin, we don't have evidence for any sort of effective treatment. So that is a story about participants that are often invisible in the published work, but it's also about evidence. It's about how do we prove a theory? How do we persuade people to take our new treatment? How do we persuade people to take our hypotheses seriously? So that's a test subject. And then the data set. And that is a bit more of an abstract piece, I think, but it's about what happens when we lose individual stories in the history of diabetes and instead start thinking about groups of people as data, as populations, as probability, and as statistics, and how that affects the way that they're treated and included in healthcare systems.
So, how did you decide on these 4 stories? Because I imagine there are many stories you could potentially tell, and I hope you continue to, by the way, and also the purposeful order in which you presented them.
The order is probably the straightforward bit. So the article goes from the person about whom we know the most, which is the famous character who is the campaigner, through to the people who we know the least about or the hardest to find in the archives. And that's the data set, because that's a situation where those people's individuality has been deliberately lost as part of the data analysis and process. So that's the order. And in terms of picking the stories, I think the categories themselves came to me quite easily. I wanted these fresh perspectives, so I didn't want to tell a story that was about particular doctors or famous inventors or discoverers or anything like that. So I thought a bit about what sort of categories of people contributed to the history of diabetes, and the idea of a campaigner, a patient, a test subject, and then the data set seemed to come fairly obvious to me. I'd read some materials about the data set in advance, and that was something I really wanted to include. So then I had to find case studies for the other 3 categories. And in terms of picking the specific ones, I think the campaigner was an obvious one because it's a name that people might recognize, but they won't necessarily recognize it as being anything to do with diabetes. I had to work a little bit harder to find my test subject and my patient. But as soon as I came across those stories reading other historical work, I knew they would be the absolute perfect examples to fit into those case studies.
Which then leads to my next question. I mean, how do you go about conducting the research for this kind of article?
So, as with all historical research, there's a lot of reading involved, but I did have a sort of cheat code for this because luckily I sometimes teach undergraduate medical students about the history of diabetes. So I've already read most of the sort of excellent historical work that's already out there about diabetes, the discovery of insulin, all that sort of thing. So some of that was just a case of going back over work that I'd already read to kind of pick out where these case studies were going to come from, identify these promising candidates for each of the different sections. And from there, I had to go on to find historical sources that would help me flesh out the case studies. Again, Campaigner was easy. It's a famous figure. There's lots of biographies about them. But I also went back and read some of their own work and some of the things like letters they published in newspapers talking about this new campaign. The data set, there was a fair bit of work in anthropology and sociology, in fact, about the people who were involved in this group, and some writing from the peoples themselves who are part of the data set that I was able to read. And when it came to the test subject and the patient, that involved going back and looking at old historical medical journals and old memoirs and biographies of people who'd been involved in those particular research areas. So it was some new historical work by other people, and then a little bit of digging into the archive and old digitized newspapers and journals to find the real detail of those particular case studies.
Well, that actually sounds like a lot of fun. I'm sure it was a ton of hours and a ton of work, but sounds like a lot of fun digging through all of that information. Now, Vanessa, as you know, the readers of Diabetes Care are diabetes clinicians and researchers. So what do you want them to take away from this article?
So I think at its most fundamental, the message of almost any history of medicine or science is firstly about the power of storytelling, which I think we're picking up here on these different case studies. But it's also just really emphasizing the fact that science and medicine are affected by culture and by society and by politics, and sometimes even by total coincidences and completely random events that happen. And there's a risk sometimes that the standard literature review style way of telling a history, that is a list of events and dates, so and so discovers this, and then someone else does a variation on that experiment, and then we test it in a different subject, and now we've got a medicine, and that's how it happened. That leaves out all of the complicating external factors about where the money came from and who funded it and whether they were having a good day in the lab and did the test subjects behave and all of that sort of stuff. And those factors, anyone involved in science knows, are essential to understanding why and how we've ended up with what we know now, and also the barriers and the opportunities to developing really good and effective healthcare measures and interventions and persuading people to actually take part in them. So I think there's a lot of historians, sometimes this is me too, who will do history because we think it is worth doing in and of itself. It doesn't have to serve any other purpose. But I don't think that means it can't be helpful to people in other disciplines. And that could be just demonstrating the value of humanities in supporting and understanding the sciences, and particularly in understanding medicine. But also, I think it might sometimes just be a nice, easy read in a journal that perhaps makes you think a little bit differently about the role of campaign groups, or the attitudes of the next patient in your clinic, or the role of your test subjects, or even just making you think twice about where the data came from in the big data sets that you use.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed reading it, and it did those things for me actually. As I was reading your article, is it made me reflect, and it made me think about what I was doing, who I was talking to, what are their stories, and it really was quite powerful. So thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Vannesa Heggie, for sharing your expertise with us today. Your piece truly was masterful. I really enjoyed reading it. It gave me a lot of food for thought, and I suspect it'll do the same for our listeners. So thank you for joining this podcast, and I strongly encourage our listeners to read the full article in the February 2026 issue of Diabetes Care.
In the February 2026 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Differential Longitudinal Effects of Glucose-Lowering Medications on Glucagon and C-peptide Responses in the Glycemia Reduction Approaches in Diabetes, or also known as the GRADE study. I'm delighted we have joining us the article's first author, Dr. Stephen Kahn. Dr. Kahn is professor of medicine in the Division of Metabolism, Endocrinology, and Nutrition, and director of the Diabetes Research Center at the University of Washington and VA Puget Sound Healthcare System in Seattle. And specifically, Dr. Kahn is our current editor-in-chief of Diabetes Care, who is responsible for launching this podcast series. So big welcome to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be here. I did not intend to launch this podcast series so that you could hear my voice all the time.
Well, Congratulations to you anyway, Stephen, and your co-authors on your feature article. The GRADE study is a comparative effectiveness clinical trial that randomized over 5,000 individuals with type 2 diabetes treated with metformin alone to the addition of either insulin glargine, the sulfonylurea glimepiride, the GLP-1 receptor agonist liraglutide, or the DPP-4 inhibitor sitagliptin, and followed participants for a mean of 5 years. Stephen, can you please take us through the high-level findings of the parent GRADE study?
Sure, Mike. And I think this is important because of the focus of glucagon in the paper that we're talking about today. So for GRADE, the primary metabolic outcome was a hemoglobin A1C of 7% or higher. That was the primary outcome. The secondary outcome was a hemoglobin A1C greater than 7.5. So when one considers the study group, like you mentioned, there were 4 different classes of medications that people were randomized to, and they were all on metformin. So it becomes a second-line therapy, and we did this comparative effectiveness study. And the primary outcome, we looked at the cumulative incidence of this outcome over time and found that it differed significantly among the 4 treatment groups. The rates with glargine and liraglutide were around about 26%, and those were lower than those with glimepiride, which was at about 30%, and sitagliptin, which did the poorest at 38%. When one considered the secondary outcome, which, as I said, was a glycated hemoglobin greater than 7.5%, the results for this outcome paralleled those of the primary outcome. And then when we did a whole bunch of subgroup analyses, the only thing that I think is really worth commenting on is that those individuals with higher baseline hemoglobin A1C concentrations appeared to have an even greater benefit with glargine and liraglutide, and also with glimepiride than we saw with sitagliptin. And then the other interesting thing, of course, is hypoglycemia, which relates again to glucagon in a way, and that severe hypoglycemia, which requires assistance, was more frequent with glimepiride than with glargine, which might have been a bit of a surprise, I think, to all of us, and clearly more frequent than what we saw with liraglutide or sitagliptin. So putting it all together, all 4 medications, when added to metformin, decreased hemoglobin A1C concentrations initially, and then over time, they increased with all treatments. However, glargine and liraglutide were significantly, although rather modestly, more effective in achieving and maintaining the targeted hemoglobin A1C levels when one compares the 4 different treatment arms.
That's great, Stephen. And so in deciphering the role of the islet in the differential response to glycemic control seen with the various classes of glucose-lowering agents in GRADE, you took a subset of over 700 participants who had beta and alpha cell function assessed at baseline and then longitudinally over follow-up. And that was assessed from measuring C-peptide and glucagon during oral glucose tolerance tests. So I think you've started to give us some of the rationale behind why this sub-study might be important. So please take us through how you selected these outcome measures.
Sure. So as you mentioned, Mike, we looked at oral glucose tolerance test data, and some of these data related to C-peptide have been published previously with a group of GRADE outcome papers showing that the beta cell function was dramatically changed by the medications in different ways. For example, insulin glargine reduces the need for insulin, so beta cell function or the output went down, whereas others stimulate secretion, so the output of insulin or C-peptide went up. Now, given we had seen the differential effects of the treatments on these primary outcome, particularly insulin and liraglutide, and also that sitagliptin as a DPP-4 inhibitor should be impacting the alpha cell, we decided that it would make sense to actually have a look at glucagon to see if we could find any evidence that glucagon was an important component of the longitudinal effects that we had observed. And to do this, we figured we could not afford to do it in everybody because of the cost of the assay. And so with the help of some very talented biostatisticians at the Coordinating Center, we concluded we needed a minimum of 100 participants in each arm who had reached the primary outcome. and who had at a minimum baseline and 1-year OGTTs that had been done. Clearly, those who went on, who reached the primary outcome, we did not look at their OGTTs afterwards because they had had other treatments added, after the secondary outcome at least. And so what we did was we took 724 participants, which was a non-randomized but a convenience sample that met these criteria of having OGTTs at baseline and 1 year, and at least 100 of them having reached the primary outcome. And we measured glucagon in them. And the assay that we used for glucagon for this particular study, we had validated extensively for the RISE study before, independent of the manufacturer of the assay. So we were fairly comfortable that the results we were going to get were going to be with an assay that we trusted.
Okay. And so, Stephen, what did you find with the glucagon measures?
Okay, so Mike, the findings are interesting and I think have clinical implications, though we can talk a little bit later again about what may or may not else be going on. We looked, as you said earlier, at baseline and longitudinal measures of alpha cell function. So we looked at baseline, 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. And we used as our measures the fasting glucose concentration and then the change in glucagon from fasting to 30 minutes following oral glucose, which we call the glucagon index. Now, this will normally decrease with glucose because you don't need the glucagon. And at the same time, you would see an increase in C-peptide as you stimulated C-peptide and insulin secretion. And we looked at these two measures, fasting and glucagon index for the alpha cell, and then fasting C-peptide and the C-peptide index for the beta cell, and related these to the primary metabolic outcome. In general, what we found was that the fasting glucagon and this glucagon index were not associated with the primary metabolic outcome, while the beta cell measures, both fasting and stimulated C-peptide, or the C-peptide index, were. We also saw that when we looked specifically for treatment-associated changes in fasting glucagon, the glucagon index, and fasting C-peptide with the primary metabolic outcome, we found no evidence of any impact. But we did see that the C-peptide index, in other words, beta cell function, when stimulated, whether we looked at models that were adjusted for a variety of parameters, including the alpha cell, or unadjusted, we found that it held up. So it seemed to us from this that ultimately the beta cell was being more important here than the alpha cell in determining the outcomes in GRADE, where we had used at least two agents that are thought to impact alpha cell function, sitagliptin and liraglutide.
And Stephen, while the baseline and treatment-associated measures of alpha cell function, as you described using glucagon measurement, were not associated with the primary metabolic outcome derived from hemoglobin A1C as a measure of glycemic control, there were differences, however, in the treatment effects on the glucagon measures across the groups. Can you take us through this and your thoughts on why these differences did not end up impacting glycemic control in this population?
So that's an interesting question, Mike. When we look at the alpha cell function measures, the fasting glucagon remained unchanged from baseline with glargine and glimepiride, and decreased nominally over time with liraglutide. That is, the numbers went down, but it was not significant, while it increased with sitagliptin. When we look at the glucagon index, that's the decrement in glucagon over the first 30 minutes following oral glucose, this decreased with glargine, which I think may be related to the inhibitory effect of insulin on the alpha cell, which is well described, and was graded with sitagliptin, which I think may be related to the fact that glucose will suppress glucagon, but in the instance of sitagliptin, the fasting glucagon was higher, so therefore the decrement was greater. When we look at things in general, individually, with the impact of the changes in glucagon, be fasting or suppressed, we see a suggestion that there may have been some effect with liraglutide, and there may have been a partial effect with sitagliptin. Certainly, there was no effect of the sulfonylurea or the insulin on alpha cell function in terms of the outcomes.
That's great, Stephen. And so if I could recap then, the differential effects on beta cell function were associated over time with protection against development of the primary metabolic outcome of deterioration of glycemic control and reaching an hemoglobin A1C of either the primary endpoint of 7.0 or the secondary 7.5. But the differential effect seen on alpha cell function as measured with the glucagon fasting or the response to oral glucose administration were not associated with those changes. And so, with that, what final takeaway messages would you have for our listeners?
Sure. So before giving you the final takeaway message, Mike, let me also throw into this last bit of the discussion that what we found with glucagon that you so nicely summarized does not mean that glucagon is not important. And I think this is incredibly important for the readers, or the listeners and readers, I suppose, to understand. We know that glucagon also has effects at the islet level. And clearly, those could still be very, very important and happening because we've only sampled humans from the periphery using measurements, therefore, that are coming out of the islet, right? Whether it be happening locally, going to the liver, having impacts in the liver, and then we're getting to measure it on the other side. And so, what we can say from this is that from these gross measures that we're using, of the gross measures that we're making using glucagon in the periphery and C-peptide in the periphery, it would appear to us that, as you summarize, the beta cell is more important. And so, therefore, I think we still need to continue the work on alpha cells, understanding a bit more what may be happening at the individual organ levels. It certainly doesn't appear that from the periphery we're seeing anything. And when it comes to the practitioner having to decide what to do about treatment, I would say to you, we should not be thinking about any potential impact on the alpha cell of the interventions, but really we should focus the choice of our medications, if we're thinking about the islet, primarily on the impact on the beta cell.
And Stephen, that's the impact on the beta cell as we can measure it clinically. And as you point out, there could be effects on the alpha cell affecting the beta cell within the islet. And so there could be really factors important for the alpha cell impacting beta cell function, which is what we're able to measure in both at baseline and as a predictor in terms of maintenance of glycemic control in response to intervention. And I'll just bring up that this important point about understanding the role of glucagon is being addressed next week at an NIDDK workshop on glucagon physiology for the 21st century. So there'll be more diving into these mechanisms of the alpha cell. And I'm sure these lessons from the GRADE study will certainly factor into important discussions. Dr. Stephen Kahn, I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I really appreciate all I learned from your article, our discussion, and the understanding of these differential effects of glucose lowering agents on our measured islet beta and alpha cell function in type 2 diabetes, and the importance that the clinical measures of beta cell function have for determining the greatest impact on long-term glycemic control. I really want to encourage our listeners to access the full article in the February issue of Diabetes Care. Let's move on now to the rapid exchange segment, where Alice and I will each discuss articles we found of particular interest this month. Alice, you want to start us off?
Yeah, for sure. So, my first pick for this month may be a bit of a surprise for our listeners. It certainly was for me when I first read it. Dr. Andrew Odegaard and colleagues from the University of California and University of Minnesota conducted a randomized 2-arm parallel trial to test the effect on glycemic control of substituting plain water for habitual artificial sweetened beverage intake by people with type 2 diabetes. 181 adults with type 2 diabetes who consumed, on average, 22 ounces per day of artificial sweetened beverages, or ASBs, were randomized to one of 2 arms. Either 24 ounces per day of either a commercial artificial sweetened beverage of choice, or an unflavored, sparkling or still, bottled or canned water of choice in place of the ASB. The primary outcome measure was the between group difference in A1C over the 24 weeks. So what did they find? At the end of 24 weeks, the group that received water had an increase in their A1C for a mean between group difference of 0.29%. The time in range decreased more in the water arm. The weight was stable in the water arm with a moderate decrease in the ASB arm with a difference of 1.11 kilograms. The authors diligently conducted per protocol and a priori sensitivity analyses, and the results remain consistent. Now, there are limited data with which to compare the results from this study, and certainly replication is needed. The authors did not suggest any potential explanations in the paper, but I gotta say, as a non-expert in this field, I'm gonna throw out a thought. I wonder if the missing sweet taste the water group experienced drove the water group to eat more sweet foods to replace that sweet sensation that their brain, their body, their person had gotten used to previously. Now, the investigators collected detailed dietary, physical activity, sleep, and quality of life data, along with gut microbiome and biological samples for metabolomics. So I anticipate we will learn more over time. This is why studies need to be done, because our hypotheses are not always right.
That is really fascinating, Alice, and an outcome that may also depend heavily on what population is being studied. This one, for the study, we're discussing having type 2 diabetes rather than overweight or obesity in the absence of diabetes. And so while we're imagining explanations for these findings, Alice, I want to throw out another one. The sweet taste perception sensed by those in the artificial sweetened beverage group might elicit what's been termed the cephalic phase insulin response, which is a neurally mediated increase in insulin secretion in anticipation of nutrient absorption that normally helps to prime our metabolism to shift towards anabolism, but might just help modestly lower glucose in those with type 2 diabetes. So, highly speculative, more studies needed. This month, for my picks, I'm going to follow a theme of pregnancy and diabetes. First up, Dr. Jamie Josephson from Northwestern University in Chicago and colleagues analyzed the effect of exposure to gestational diabetes to mid-childhood obesity in the SWIFT study. The SWIFT study included over 800 mothers with gestational diabetes treated by diet or glyburide who enrolled in a prospective cohort where their children were assessed for body mass index between 5 and 11 years of age. Early diagnosis of gestational diabetes prior to the standard time frame of 24 weeks when screening would routinely be performed. That early diagnosis was associated with a significantly increased risk for the development of obesity in offspring at a mean 9.5 years following delivery. This increased risk was similar for mothers treated with glyburide as well as those who were treated with diet alone. So these findings suggest that preconception care that might reduce not only the risk for developing gestational diabetes, but also its duration for those affected might improve metabolic outcomes for offspring later in childhood.
And we see more and more data over time of the importance of that in utero exposure. It's almost in some way, I'm not going to call it fate because we can change it, but the path that we go on really starts way early before we're born, literally before we're born, that will have impacts on our future, right? So it's actually very interesting finding. Thank you very much, Mike. My second pick dives into precision medicine, but not for diabetes management per se, but rather for prediabetes. Professor Robert Wagner and colleagues from Europe, UK, and the United States provide a Perspectives in Care article entitled Beyond Glucose, Rethinking Prediabetes for Precision Prevention. In the article, they discuss the heterogeneity of prediabetes. We've classically defined prediabetes categorically based on glucose levels, which is not enough to identify clinically relevant subtypes. They identified 6 reproducible prediabetes subtypes, integrating insulin sensitivity, insulin secretion, visceral and hepatic fat, along with genetic risk. 3 of the subtypes were low risk for progression. They were called healthy overweight, healthy lean, and healthy obese. 3 subtypes, however, were deemed high risk. They were progressing prediabetes with beta cell failure, progressing prediabetes with fatty liver, and slow progressors with hyperinsulinemic insulin resistance. Now, these subtypes are associated with distinct trajectories toward diabetes and complication patterns. For example, the slow progressors were, by definition, very slow to progress to diabetes, but they had the highest overall mortality and earlier signs of chronic kidney disease. So identifying these different subtypes may allow for more tailored interventions and more appropriate and timely screening for complications that can actually predate the diagnosis of diabetes. Now, at the moment, prediabetes subtyping is too burdensome for routine clinical use, but there is a web-based prediabetes subtype calculator that exists for research purposes, and the link is in the article. So please check it out if you're interested. Now, until ready for routine clinical use, I think this concept of heterogeneity in prediabetes makes a ton of clinical sense and reminds us to identify those higher risk individuals with greater visceral adiposity, with fatty liver, with clinically apparent insulin resistance, and intervene earlier and screen for accompanying comorbidities, not just progression to diabetes, but screen for cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, mast cell D, along with others.
Correct. And others, including a similar approach, might help Alice to identify those women we just discussed at increased risk for experiencing gestational diabetes. And so, returning to the theme of pregnancy and diabetes, my next pick examines the association of gestational diabetes with accelerated biological age in middle-aged and elderly women. Dr. Bin Wang from the National University of Singapore and colleagues identified Paris women from the UK Biobank who'd completed a survey on a history of gestational diabetes that was linked to hospital records and had biological aging biomarkers available to calculate these women's biologic age using phenoage. Biologic aging acceleration was determined from the residuals derived by regressing the phenoage estimates on the chronologic age of the study participants. Now, among almost 180,000 women, approximately 1,100 in this cohort had a history of gestational diabetes, and that was associated with a biological age acceleration of over 2 years. This even in the absence of subsequent development of type 2 diabetes. Importantly, this accelerated biologic aging mediated the association of gestational diabetes with adverse health outcomes in the future, including type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality. Understanding how gestational diabetes may accelerate biologic aging could help point to new approaches for improving long-term health outcomes for those women affected.
I got to say, I'm listening to this, Mike, and I'm thinking of all the women I see every week with GDM and really hoping that they don't read this in the press. and I'm not saying information should be suppressed in any way, but I'm just imagining how a woman with a history of GDM would feel reading this, sort of realizing that either their current GDM, if they're actively pregnant now, or the GDM that they had is going to contribute to them being biologically older and what that will mean for long term. And I mean, I think the silver lining part would be to say, okay, we understand that we need to take a GDM history very seriously when we meet a new patient and they give us a history of GDM. It's not just, oh, something that happened years ago when you were pregnant, but it's actually a marker of a higher risk individual. And we need to be super proactive with all risk factor modification. But I was just imagining the headline that could come from what you just described. Let's hope it doesn't. So my final pick is a reminder that diabetes remains an important risk factor for coronary stent failure. Now, this may seem like an unusual question to ask, as it's already well established that those with diabetes have more coronary stent failure, but those data were actually generated with first-generation coronary stents. Less is known about the risk with second-generation drug-eluting stents. So Dr. Irene Santos-Pardo and colleagues from Sweden conducted an observational study of all patients in Sweden who received a second-generation drug-eluting stent between 2010 and 2020 and categorized them as having type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or no diabetes, which was the reference group. Over 160,000 individuals were included in the analysis, 2,406 of whom had type 1 diabetes, which was 1.5%, and over 43,000 with type 2 diabetes. Over a mean follow-up of 4.5 years, 5,510 stent failures occurred, defined in in-stent restenosis or stent thrombosis. The fully adjusted hazard ratio for stent failure was 2.28 for type 1 diabetes, 1.35 for type 2 diabetes compared to those without diabetes. This tells us that those living with diabetes are at higher risk of coronary stent failure, even with second-generation drug-eluting stents, which means that careful consideration of optimal revascularization strategies and closer follow-up are warranted, particularly in those living with type 1 diabetes.
Thanks, Alice. This article certainly reminds us that the benefit of considering coronary artery bypass grafting when possible over stenting for our patients with diabetes may still exist, especially for those with complex coronary artery lesions. My last pick in the theme of pregnancy and diabetes comes from Dr. Jin Yu at the Catholic University of Korea in Seoul and colleagues, who examined the association between estrogen-related factors and risk for dementia in postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes. Almost 160,000 postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes were identified from the Korean National Health Information Database, with about 24,000 cases of dementia identified. Those with a reproductive lifespan, which is defined by spanning from menarche to menopause, more than 40 years compared to those women whose reproductive lifespan was less than 30 years, was associated with a 27% lower risk for dementia, with a similar risk reduction associated with women ever compared with never giving birth. A 17% lower risk for dementia was also observed for those who use hormone replacement therapy compared to not using estrogen. And so while diabetes has clearly been associated as an independent risk for increased dementia, it's nice to see the potentially protective effects of estrogen in women against dementia, and that these extend to those women with type 2 diabetes.
I guarantee you, every female listening to this right now is doing the math in her head in terms of what was her reproductive span if she's already postmenopausal, and probably trying to figure out the numbers right now. I think this area is quite fascinating because we understand the benefits of menopause hormone treatment in terms of treating vasomotor symptoms, right? That's very clear, and urogenital symptoms, et cetera. But its impact on the brain in terms of human data and human studies is more emerging at this point. And my understanding is there's a window of opportunity to actually intervene with menopause hormone treatment post-menopause to potentially have these brain benefits. And these association type data exist certainly outside of diabetes, but as you've now shown, within diabetes. So it's an interesting area to continue to follow. So thank you very much for sharing this with us, Mike. And well, this brings us to the end of the February 2026 episode of Diabetes Care on Air.
A big thank you to Drs. Vannesa Heggie and Stephen Kahn for sharing their expertise with us. And a big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Diabetes Care on Air.
And remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. And I want to make a special mention that this month's cover art is directly related to the piece discussed in my interview with Dr. Vannesa Heggie. And I'm going to also say, spoiler alert, when you look at the cover.
And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about new episodes of this podcast. Thank you for listening.